We have Noah and the flood in 2705 BCE. From Noah and the flood, all of humanity emerges. So we can use Noah as a starting point. So, almost 5,000 years ago, and that is a manageable period of time to deal with. In 1813 BCE, Abraham was born. Abraham was the first Hebrew. There's the Tower of Babel, and all of humanity was dispersed, and the languages were divided, and people spread out all over the earth. After Abraham, you had Isaac, and then you had Jacob. Jacob was renamed Israel. Israel had 12 sons. In about 1800 BCE, the 12 sons of Jacob went down to Egypt, and Joseph, his favorite son, ruled over them in Egypt. In Egypt, they were oppressed. In 1445 BCE, they came up out of Egypt. They then received the Torah and Mount Sinai. And again, they then received the Torah on Mount Sinai. And they continued and conquered the land of Canaan and divided up amongst their tribes. In 1100 BCE, David was born. He became king. First temple was built by his son Solomon in 959 BCE. In 913 BCE, the 12 tribes divided between Judah and Israel. That is Judah and the 10 tribes. Judah was in the south together with the tribe of Benjamin, and after that also of Levi, and represented minorities from the other tribes, whereas the majority of Israel were in the north in 10 tribes. These 10 tribes were exiled. They were conquered by the Assyrians and taken into exile. In the 700s BCE. In the 500s BCE, the first temple was destroyed. The Jews were scattered all over the earth, as it had been prophesied, whereas the 10 tribes remained together in one cohesive body of people, or several separate cohesive bodies of their tribes, and they migrated. Some of them migrated by way of the sea, others by over land. They moved to the north and the west, and they recoalesced in northwest Europe. And they gave rise to modern nations. They gave rise to the nations of Western Europe, and these nations in turn produced the USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and other peoples. We have the areas of Western Europe, North and West Europe, as the prophet prophesied in Hosea, that the lost tribes would be in those areas in the book of Abijah, and his prophecy said the lost tribes would exist, they would continue to function, and they would be found in these areas, and they would have a task in world history to fulfill, and they have fulfilled it. And one of the major activists were the people of the British Isles. The people of the British Isles are dominated by the tribes of Joseph, of Ephraim and Manasseh. And we have history. We have history of peoples who came to the British Isles. And we know, the scholars tell us, when peoples came to this area. So how can we say that the lost tribes are amongst them? So let us see what scholars say and what the reality is, and compare it. flood took place in about 2700 BCE, and the first settlers of Britain on the island after that, because before then it was covered with water, the first settlers of Britain on the island after that were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. That is, they didn't cultivate fields, they were not, but they wandered around and gathered plants and gathered food that grew naturally, and they hunted animals. They're known as hunter-gatherers. And there were two groups of them, the first ones and the second one. The second one may have been connected to the Middle East, and their haplogroups, Y-DNA haplogroups, belong to the IJK group, found in Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. Of Europe, modern Europeans. Most Europeans are a mixture. Western haplogroups, early European farmers, Western steppe herders. They are the three main groups that populated the British Isles. These early Western hunter-gatherers were followed by the early European farmers. The early European farmers introduced the so-called Neolithic age, that is Stone Age, New Stone Age civilization. And they were responsible for most of the megalithic monuments, the dolmens and great monuments that we find in the West that are similar to those of the Near East, to those of Israel and Jordan and related areas. And these people in Europe, also in Britain, these early European farmers who introduced the Neolithic age, they came from Anatolia and the Near East, that is from the area of Israel, of Lebanon, of Jordan, and of Turkey, and of related areas around that region, and of Syria, where the Israels had been before they had been exiled. And this is agreed to. The scholars agree to this, that these early European farmers who introduced the Neolithic age, they came from Anatolia. And they had their DNA was the same as that of Anatolians of the period, and this was the same as Turkish peoples of today, of the Kurds who live in the same region, and of the Armenians. And these peoples have the same DNA as the Jews, of the present-day Jews, present-day Jewish males have the same DNA or very similar DNA to the Turks, the Kurds, and the Armenians, to the Anatolians. The Palestinians also have a similar DNA. The Palestinians also have a similar DNA to that, but they have an additional input from Saudi Arabia and from Africa and from other places. But apart from that, their DNA is also similar to that of the Jews, of the Kurds, the Turks and Armenians. And this DNA is usually taken according to the mainstream scientific opinion as meaning that somehow or somewhere or other they had the same ancestry. Have the same DNA, you have the same forefathers. That's what they say. We agreed to that with that up to a point. In other words, we say that DNA means that the forefathers of the people concerned probably lived in the same area. They were there at the same time when certain events took place, and the DNA that happened then was fixed and and for henceforth inherited and passed on by heredity until the next time. And this happens even today. We have so-called DNA transposons. What are transposons? They're the animals need to make a change, to an adaptation, to survive. So they take in genetic properties from neighboring groups. For instance, we had certain types of fish that had to change their places of breeding to go to areas that were much colder than they had previously been in. But in order to do that, they needed a gene that contained antifreeze that worked on the basis of antifreeze that would enable them to survive in that area. So where did they get the gene from? They took the gene from neighboring fish that had it. These neighboring fish, working on the basis similar to a virus, transmitted the quality to them. And they passed it on. They passed it on very quickly, almost overnight, to their own groups, and henceforth their own groups had it. And in some cases, they in their turn passed it on to another group that also needed it. These are events that have been recorded and have been confirmed, that DNA changes can be moved from one body to another, and sometimes the body is concerned and not one person, not one individual, but the whole group can be affected in the same way. And we understand that DNA works in that way. In other words, what we are saying is the Kurds, the Turks and the Armenians, and also some of the Palestinians were in the Middle East alongside the Jews at the one and the same time. Therefore, they had similar DNA, because at that particular time, the DNA was determined, was imprinted upon them for some reason or other, and henceforth it was passed on to their descendants. And this DNA was in the region of Anatolia in the Near East, and it was the DNA that the early settlers of Britain and Ireland in the Neolithic age received. And they received this DNA. And they built the megalithic monuments that are exact copies of what monuments that were found in the area of the Near East. The dolmens originated in the land of Israel. And the early European farmers copied them, introduced them, and they are a characteristic feature of. And these early European features, these early European farmers, on the whole, they replaced the hunter-gathering people. The males amongst hunter-gatherers, about 6'2", were about 6'2". They had blue eyes, they had dark hair. Modern sources say they had black or very dark skin, but it has been claimed that this is none other than woke New Age publicity, and there's no way of knowing what colour their skin was, but it doesn't really matter what colour their skin was. But they were different from the Neolithic peoples. The Neolithic peoples were smaller, they were 5'2", the average male. Had brown eyes, dark brown hair. And they were followed by the Bell Beakers, who were 5'6" on the average, and had blue eyes and a fair-coloured skin, and sometimes red hair. And they came after the early European farmers. 90% of the people of Britain and Ireland were replaced by the Bell Beakers. The Bell Beakers replaced them. replaced 90% of them. In Europe, not all of them were replaced. A larger percentage remained. Also, early hunter-gatherers also remained. They're a minority, but they are quite numerous and influential, and they too existed. These Neolithics, getting back to the Neolithics, had the same DNA as the Jews and as other peoples in the Near East. And the haplogroup I was important, so was G2A important, and J1 was important. They also had elements R1b. They produced megalithic civilization. Towards the end of their period, they began to introduce the working of copper, Chalcolithic period, and their DNA began to change. Before then, R1b had existed amongst them, but had not been dominant, but they began to strengthen itself, come to the fore. When along came the Bell Beakers, we'll explain a little bit more on this. We should note that this, how we are describing it, is somewhat oversimplified. So we're concentrating on Britain and Ireland because they are for different reasons. Amongst these reasons are that it's easier to explain them, just most straightforward and simple what happened in those areas than in Europe. At all events, similar changes took place in Europe, but in some areas there were a greater number of early European farmers, and some of these early European farmers became part of the Celtic civilizations, and later from about 100 BCE, or a little bit beforehand, when many people from Gaul, from France, entered south and eastern England. Many of them were of early European farmer origin. So that is to say, they gave an extra infusion into Britain after they had been after their forefathers had been replaced by the Bell Beakers. The Bell Beakers were R1b. Almost 100% R1b. R1b DNA of the Bell Beakers had existed in Anatolia, had existed in the same place where the early European farmers came from. But somehow or other it had divided out, and the Bell Beakers had been taken over, and they were almost. Whereas in Anatolia it had been alongside other haplotypes amongst the Bell Beakers, it was universally throughout applicable to them. And one possible explanation is that the R1b may grant a certain degree of immunity, of resistance, natural resistance to the plague and other afflictions, and that when the early Bell Beakers came to the west, the plague came with them, and it afflicted the natives living there, especially the males, more than it afflicted the Bell Beakers. So the Bell Beakers replaced them. Modern science does not agree with this, but has been discussed. There are papers concerning it. The possibility has not been entirely rejected. So that is something worth keeping in mind also. But the bottom point is also that the R1b also came from the same areas that the Neolithic early European farmers came from. That in effect, and ultimately they were one and the same people. This accords with prophecies that said that these areas would be populated by the Lost Ten Tribes, and they would do that which in history has shown they have done. They would create a great empire that would help civilize the world, and they would establish civilization as it now exists, and they would be where they are now are present, with the characteristics that they now have. So according to this, The findings, when you understand them properly, of DNA or science and of chronology all come together and all with the Bible and all confirm biblical prophecy and help us understand what is going on. May Lord God of Israel help us and guide us and protect us. Thank you.